Hello and welcome. You're watching an exclusive interview series by South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. I'm your host, Heman, and today I will be talking with the Nikhil Mandalaparthy. He's a writer, organizer, and art creator who is passionate about history, religion, and arts of South Asia and South Asian diaspora. He serves as the Deputy Executive Director of Hindus for Human Rights, a non-profit organization that works towards pluralism, human rights, and the justice for all in South Asia and beyond. Nikhil Mandalaparthy completed his undergraduate and master's degree at the University of Chicago. His writings on South Asia history, politics, and the religion has appeared in Foreign Policy, Scroll, The Diplomat, Dawn, and elsewhere. Nikhil has worked and conducted research at the World Bank, the Estemis Center, and the University of Washington. He serves on the executive board of Sadhana, a coalition of progressive Hindus, and in an alumni of South Asia Americans leading toward Young Leader Institute. So without any further ado, let's get straight into the question. So my first question is, would you like to tell us about your childhood and education or any challenges that you have encountered?
Sure. Yeah, and thank you for having me, Heman. I'm excited to be part of this collaboration today. I can share a little bit about my experience growing up. So I grew up in the United States, in Washington State specifically. My parents immigrated here from India in the 80s and the 90s. And so my family comes from South India, from Andhra Pradesh specifically. And I grew up in, I would say, a pretty homogenous school and neighborhood that was mostly white. And so I was usually one of the only South Asian or Indian kids in my classes at school, but from elementary school all through high school. But there were a lot of South Asian and Indian specifically families in the area. And so growing up, my family's social circle and social network was largely other South Indian families, mostly upper caste families specifically. And so I grew up in that sort of like bubble, I would say, of upper caste, Telugu, Tamil, mostly Brahmin, actually families in the area. And so that definitely had an effect on my own perception of what it means to be Indian, what it means to be Hindu. And it wasn't until much later in my life when I got to college that I started to learn more about the dynamics that were going on there and sort of expanding my own understanding of those identities. But I did have a pretty good childhood growing up. I think like for me, it was I was involved in activities such as Model United Nations and interested in international affairs. And it wasn't until high school that I got more interested in politics in South Asia and specifically in India, where Narendra Modi was elected as prime minister during my junior year of high school. And then shortly after, I was seeing, when I went into college, the election of Donald Trump here in the US, and seeing in both cases the rise of this Hindu nationalist ideology, both in India, of course, but also in the US with groups like Hindus for Trump and Republican Hindu Coalition. And so that's what really kind of struck me, was seeing this rising right-wing sentiment from people who shared the same identity as me, and this really vitriolic kind of Islamophobia, anti-Muslim sentiments that seem to unite the right wing in the US with right wing in India. And so for the last several years, part of what I've been trying to do is counter that rightward shift in the community and push back and speak out against caste as well as Hindu nationalism and Islamophobia.
That's nice to know. Now, would you like to tell us about the source of your motivation or inspiration for working for Hindus and caste and caste system?
Sure. I mean, I think I grew up always fairly interested in religion and culture and history. And like I said, it was a pretty homogenous, overwhelmingly white kind of environment that I was in at school and just in my neighborhood. And so for me, those identities of being Indian, of being Hindu, to me, those were sort of what made me special and set me apart from all the other kids. And it was something that I could sort of take pride in as making me unique. And so I was always very excited when, India would come up in our classes, or I was able to share a little bit more about my culture or heritage. But I will say, once I got into high school and started learning more politically about what was happening in India and the rise of Hindutva or Hindu nationalism under the leadership of Narendra Modi and his government, that really posed a serious question for me, because up till then, as a upper caste man, like I've only faced, the best parts of I guess what you could say the Hindu tradition had to offer. I was sort of coming at it from the most privileged position, and then all of a sudden I was seeing all these news articles about lynchings of Muslims and Dalits by sort of Hindu vigilante mobs. It's rising like hate speech against Muslims and other minorities by individuals and leaders who claim to represent Hindu interests, the Hindu community. Really just seeing like the weaponization of the tradition, whether it's gods like Rama or Hanuman, or festivals that are in celebration of those deities, or everyday incidents of minorities being beaten up or attacked by groups and individuals who claim to be doing so and in the name of a Hindu identity and Hindu tradition. That's what really got me to start questioning, where are the Hindus who are speaking out against this, right? If there are right-wing Hindus, where are the Hindus who are coming at it from a more progressive and inclusive standpoint, and actually trying to lift up the traditions of religious pluralism and communal harmony that many Hindus still believe in. And I wasn't really finding a lot of scholars or activists who were working as Hindus to speak out against Hindu nationalism until I found this organization, Sadhana, Coalition of Progressive Hindus, and then later Hindus for Human Rights. And then at the same time, when it comes to caste, like I mentioned, I grew up in a very upper caste kind of bubble. And so my whole perception of what it meant to be Hindu in Indian was shaped by that. And it wasn't until I got to college where I was first exposed to the works of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and reading more about caste discrimination, both in India and in the diaspora, really trying to come to terms with like, what does it mean to be against caste and to really reject this sort of system, but also to come from a tradition which created caste and which whose scriptures kind of originate the notions of Varna and have perpetuated these sort of beliefs around the caste system and untouchability for so long. Is it possible to be Hindu and to reject caste at the same time? That was a real question that, of course, many people coming from some of the Ambedkarite movements and contemporary Dalit movements would say, no, it's not possible to reject caste and to remain Hindu. But at the end of the day, this is particularly for Hindus who grew up in the diaspora. This is a identity which is quite fluid, and people are able to make of it what they want. And so, with Sadhana and Hindus for Human Rights, what we're trying to do is articulate: is there a way to be Hindu and to reject caste, drawing on the long legacy of anti-caste reformers and leaders and movements from within Hindu traditions, from Bhakti traditions, from modern leaders as well. And so that's another avenue of work that we're also trying to do, is not just to get Hindus to speak out against Hindu nationalism, Islamophobia, but also to confront caste, which has a much deeper and longer history, within our traditions.
I really appreciate the course that you're working on. So moving to our next third question, can you please tell us about the Ramayana and Mahabharata? from Dalit and other oppressed caste communities?
For sure. I think, the one of the resources that we have as progressive Hindus who are trying to reshape and transform the tradition to align with, our progressive values and commitment to social justice, is that we have this like large corpus to draw on of stories and myths and figures and characters to look back at and try to figure out what contemporary relevance could look like. And so one source for that is the epics that many South Asians and particularly Hindus grow up with, the Ramayana and Mahabharata. And it's really interesting to learn that, or actually the thing which is not so great is that over the last few decades, and I would say since at least the 1980s, epics like the Mahabharata and Ramayana have really been homogenized by the Indian right-wing and Hindu nationalist groups to present a very unified kind of monolithic narrative of this is the Ramayana. So you have the TV show, which was very popular in the 80s in India, which was presenting a very specific version of the Ramayana. I grew up in the US reading Amar Chitra Katha comics of the Ramayana, which were only telling the Valmiki Ramayana, a very specific version of that. And it wasn't until I got to college where I learned that there was such a diversity of retellings of the Ramayana story and the Mahabharata story. And so a lot of those retellings, particularly when they have come from Dalit or caste oppressed communities, have actually inverted things or flipped them on their head or highlighted characters which were very minor in other upper caste retellings and really elevated them to prominent positions. And I think two examples that stick out for me in modern times that people have engaged with are Shambhuka from the Ramayana and Eklavya from Mahabharata. And so like for Eklavya, for example, he's this tribal, Adivasi student who is very proficient in archery and learns from a murti of his teacher because he's not allowed to actually physically learn from him. He eventually surpasses the princes and royal students of this teacher, and then the teacher doesn't want him to do that, so he actually demands that he cut off his thumb and offer it as a tribute or a guru dakshina to him, and thus not allowing him to shoot a bow and arrow ever again. And so a lot of Dalit writers and other caste oppressed writers in India have done really powerful work with this figure of Eklavya and really kind of reclaiming him. There's a lot of really powerful poetry that deals with the figure of Eklavya and turns him into this symbol of resistance and asking him, don't cut off your thumb, or we will not cut off your thumb even though you did. We will stand up and fight back against the oppression that we face. And similarly, the figure of Shambhuka is also someone that's been engaged with by a lot of these writers. One really powerful play that I've been engaging with and reading for the last over the last year has been this Kannada play called Shudra Tapasvi. It's by a Kannada writer named Kuvempu, who came from a Shudra background himself, and he was a staunch devotee of Rama. He had written this magnum opus kind of retelling of the Ramayana in Kannada, but he was really disturbed by the incident of the story of Shambhuka from the Ramayana, which most traditional retellings say that Shambhuka was a Shudra ascetic who was doing tapas or austerity, and this was something that is not allowed for people from Shudra castes or Dalit backgrounds. It was only supposed to be done by upper caste people. And so in order to maintain sort of the caste balance and hierarchy, Rama beheads Shambhuka to restore the life of a Brahmin boy who had fallen dead. And so this was quite a minor incident in a lot of Ramayana retellings. It happens at the very end, but a lot of Dalit writers and caste oppressed writers have, in the modern era, really latched onto this figure of Shambhuka and trying to highlight the caste violence and oppression that Rama inflicted on them, saying that why should we revere Rama when he did this to a Shudra ascetic? And so Kuvempu's play in Kannada, the Shudra Tapasvi, it was written in like the 1940s, and Kuvempu actually inverts that story. And so Rama in the end does actually not, he doesn't behead Shambhuka. He actually bows down to him and reveres him and delivers this sort of sermon to a very casteist Brahmin, saying that, you know, someone who's doing these sort of tapas, austerities, should not be, you know, killed or confronted, but actually should be revered, and, you know, caste should not matter in these sort of situations. And so it actually turns the story completely on its head and presents a much more thoughtful and justice-oriented vision of Rama, I would say. And so those are just like a few examples of how I think a lot of these writers and activists and figures, rather than just throwing the stories away and saying, you know, we just don't want to engage at all with these epics or other sort of myths and legends, it's a very like nuanced and deep exploration of what's in here, that what can we play with, what can we, you know, retell and transform, and then present, you know, a very different understanding of these stories that aligns with contemporary movements for equality and social justice.
So, as you mentioned about the writers, I would like to go ahead with that. That the representation of the upper caste writer is a discourse or of pity. Is that true?
So that's something that I don't know if I can answer as someone who's not, you know, a Dalit, over whether, you know, the representation by upper caste writers is fair or not. I will say that, you know, there's a strong movement, you know, here in the United States, and I think similarly in India, not just have people from privileged classes or castes, you know, write about the oppression of marginalized groups, whether that's, you know, white people here or privileged castes back in India, but rather to uplift the voices coming directly from those communities. And I think there has been, at least here in the diaspora, you know, a rise in narratives and books and memoirs coming from people from Dalit backgrounds, like Yashika Dutt and Sujata Gidla, Suraj Yangde. All these people are based, you know, in the United States and come from Dalit backgrounds and have written memoirs and stories of their own experiences. And I think those are most important to sort of uplift it when it comes to understanding caste and how it manifests, you know, in people's lives, especially people from Dalit backgrounds. And so I think rather than having more upper caste writers write about caste oppression, it makes a lot more sense to just hear directly from people who are affected by that oppression. And that's not to say that upper caste people should not write about caste, but when we do, it should be largely with the goal of, you know, uncovering what is going on within our families and our communities that has perpetuated this sort of caste bias, caste hierarchy, because we, at the end of the day, we also need, you know, the rejection of caste cannot just come from marginalized communities or Dalits and oppressed caste. We need upper caste people to also speak out against it and reject it and acknowledge the ways that we have also been complicit in maintaining these sort of systems. And so that's what I would say is more about listening to the many Dalit authors and writers who are publishing today. And then when it comes to upper caste writers, you know, really confronting our own experiences and introspecting rather than writing about other people's experiences.
No, that makes sense. So, so as you grew up in USA, are you familiar with any cases of caste discrimination in your own friend or family circles?
I feel like I mentioned, I grew up in a very fairly homogenous upper caste kind of environment in the United States, and so my perception of what it meant to be Hindu or what it meant to be Indian was really shaped by that. And so I grew up thinking, that all the vast majority of Indians were vegetarian, for example, or that doing the Upanayanam or thread ceremony was something that every Hindu boy did growing up. It was just a coming of age kind of ceremony. When, of course, if you look at the actual statistics of vegetarianism in India, for example, my family is Telugu, and so in the Telugu states, proportion of vegetarians is only like 2%, at most. And so my understanding of Telugu cuisine and what it means to have cuisine from our states, I was thinking everyone was vegetarian, but actually 98% of people in Andhra and Telangana eat meat. And so that was an aspect of my culture that I would say that we as vegetarians are kind of the outliers to the norm, and we are actually not the center of things, but actually very much an outlier when it comes to those habits. And similarly, knowing that the Upanayanam or thread ceremony is not performed by every Hindu family, but actually it's usually mostly just upper caste families, and specifically Brahmin families who perform that thread ceremony. That's something which I just didn't know, because every other family around me, for the most part, were other Telugu or Tamil Brahmins, and so all of their sons would also do get the punal or sacred thread. And so it wasn't until much later that I was able to realize that actually my experience was not the norm, and actually came from a very privileged and elite kind of background. And because of the demographic makeup of the Indian American community, most people in the community are coming from that upper caste background. And so it becomes the normative idea of Indian culture, is mostly upper caste Indian culture. And there was a survey that was done last year by an organization called the Carnegie Endowment, which found that around half of Hindus in the United States actually didn't identify with a particular caste. But among those who did identify, 80% said that they came from an upper caste background. And so it is a very warped or a different kind of demographic profile than what it is back in India, where Brahmins make up like 4% of the population. Here, Brahmins make up actually a much larger proportion of the population. And so those sort of cultural practices, dietary practices, festivals, all of that becomes presented in a way as sort of the normative idea of what it means to be Indian or be Hindu.
Have you noticed any comparison or differences in the way the Indian diaspora talk about caste parallel to their home country?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think, the Indian diaspora, when it comes to talking about caste, there's a lot of work that needs to be done to begin with. There's very little, I think, awareness of how caste shows up or how it functions. A lot of people sometimes present their own caste identity as just their cultural background. And so you see this particularly with, the Punjabi Sikh community, where there's a lot of people who come from the Jat caste, displaying that very proudly. And, you hear it in songs and in music. And it's presented just as like a cultural kind of label that, we are Punjabi and we are Sikh, and specifically we are Jat. And so that's like a way in which actually a lot of Punjabi Sikhs who are Dalit or come from other backgrounds are kind of marginalized, in that community. And very, very similarly, within, Hindu communities, you hear phrases like Tam Brahm, very casually thrown around, Tamil Brahmin as an identity. And again, that it's presented often as just a cultural identity of this is just who I am and this is how I grew up. But there's very little introspection of like, what does that actually mean to assert that you are coming from a Brahmin caste and to celebrate that as just like who you are. Yes, there are cultural practices associated with that. There's, dietary and the way that you wear clothes and the festivals and things you celebrate are definitely informed by your caste background. But it's not, I think there has to be a little bit more introspection of what does that mean, because caste is hierarchical and it implicitly has this notion of some people being higher than others. And of course, on that side also, there are these whole kind of matrimonial conventions and events that are held for specific caste communities. And so, there are a lot of Patel organizations in the US, which are, again, a very specific business, merchant caste in the United States. There are conventions for a lot of the different, like, Telugu associations, which again, I'm Telugu, and so you actually have organizations that say that we are like North American Telugu Association or American Telugu Association, but in reality, these are mostly just caste groups. So one of these Telugu groups is for Kammas, one of them is for Reddis, and it's kind of this unspoken kind of reality, but it really does inform how a lot of communities organize themselves, even in the US, even if it's not kind of explicitly stated.
That's very true. What keeps the caste hierarchy in place today? What power structure created by colonial era that still exists today?
Yeah, I mean, I think the colonial era definitely reified and strengthened some aspects of caste, but it's hard to say that, a lot of people coming from the right wing will say that caste didn't exist since before the British era, or that, it was the British who created caste oppression or hierarchy. And I don't think that's accurate, but definitely the British reified and certainly probably strengthened caste divisions in some ways. I think about the practice of the census when it comes to religion, making people choose one box of Hindu or Muslim or Sikh, and really firming up the notion of like rigid religious identities and boundaries. And I think similarly, this British policy definitely was divisive on the basis of caste as well. And so I think that definitely informs some of the current realities today. But as we all know, India is independent, and many of us in the diaspora are spread all over the world, and caste discrimination still persists. And I think that definitely, Hindus, Indians, South Asians more broadly are not immune to the desire to kind of lift yourself up and put other people down. I think that's, at the end of the day, it's a human tendency that we see being replicated along the lines of gender or race or class, this desire to put yourself higher than others. And caste is one other way in which this manifests itself. And it's firstly, I think that the only way that we can really confront it and actually eliminate this system of caste is to get the people with the most privilege and power in the system to reject it. And so it's not just about, we need to have a vibrant, Dalit rights movement and Dalit and caste activists leading this movement. But we also need people like, upper caste families and very orthodox Brahmin families also need to recognize the way that caste limits them. And caste is a harmful, hierarchical kind of aspect of all of our lives that is really harming our ability to connect with others, to imagine broader community and relationships. And so that's what I think that one of our roles as Hindus for Human Rights, our organization, is to speak specifically to that portion of the community who are Hindu or come from privileged positions, and try to educate them on how we all need to be part of the anti-caste movements.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. Where are you in the caste hierarchy, and what has that meant for you, for your life, and how has the caste system constructed or benefited you?
Like I mentioned before, I come from a Brahmin family, Telugu Brahmin family, and so that has its benefits, as I mentioned earlier. Growing up in a very homogeneously upper caste environment, not really having to question anything until I got to college and was around a more diverse range of people. Definitely, I think a lot of people who come from similar caste backgrounds have a degree of generational privilege. It's at the end of the day, those of us who are here means that our parents or grandparents had enough resources for a high quality education back home, for learning English and having English fluency, for having enough money and resources to in some way get people to get a plane ticket, or establish some sort of footing when it comes to uh, establishing themselves in the United States. And all of that requires a degree of social power or social capital and financial capital. And so I would say that all of that is a function of caste and class and just general kind of privilege. And so that's a way in which my background has also gotten me to where I am. And I think it's true for a lot of Indian Americans who will talk a lot about their family's class background or financial background, but not so much how caste may have played a role in that as well, because we know that upper caste families, Brahmin families, had longer access to formal education and literacy and particularly English medium education in comparison to some other communities, which is why, again, the makeup of the diaspora is so skewed in favor of upper caste people.
I would like to share something short and quick that I have read it somewhere that caste system is very much inherited in the Indian society. Even if you die, people would talk on about your caste. If you do conversion, just like I have the interview with Jamin, he converted to the Buddhism. Still, the people target him on his caste. So that's how it works. Moving forward, despite sharing the same religion, upper caste Hindus alienates Dalit people and hardly consider them the part of the very religion. Why Dalit people lack religion protocol despite having the same religion boundaries?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question, and one that people have been asking for over 100 years now. And actually, I can trace it back to figures like Chokha from Maharashtra, who lived in medieval period hundreds of years ago. And even at that time, Chokha coming from a Dalit caste, was not allowed into the temple of Vittala at Pandharpur, and was actually, he's buried there. His samadhi is outside of the temple grounds, and so he actually was never allowed, inside to have darshan of his beloved Vittala. And so, this is not a new phenomenon by any means. This exclusion, particularly from religious spaces, sacred spaces, from religious equality. And I think that definitely there has been progress that has been made in terms of temple entry movements and opening up some level of engagement and just being able to participate in religious life. But you hear about stories all the time of Dalit families not being allowed to temples, or I remember last year during Navratri, a Dalit woman and her daughter not being allowed to do Garba in Gujarat and things like that, not being allowed to participate in holy celebrations. So there's clearly like a long way to go, and not in any way to say that things are solved, but I think that what we need more of are Hindu leaders and Hindu temples taking a very clear stand against caste discrimination, against untouchability, against this prohibition of temple entry. Because at the end of the day, those of us who are activists or in social justice movements can put a lot of pressure and public pressure on these institutions, but we need those who are in power to make those sort of changes. And that's something that we at Hindus for Human Rights are very committed to doing, is keep putting pressure and shifting the leaders in our community to take clear stances against caste and Islamophobia and all of those sort of things. And it's a struggle that needs to happen across religious communities as well, because we know that whether you're talking about Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, all religious communities in South Asia really have imbibed and transformed caste in their own ways. And so we work very closely with Dalit Christian leaders, with scholars such as Khalid Anis Ansari, who works on caste discrimination among Muslims in South Asia, and really trying to present this struggle as something that needs to happen across religious communities, whether you're Hindu or Muslim, Sikh, Christian, or any other community. Caste has shown up in your spaces, in your masjids or gurdwaras or churches or mandirs, temples as well. So there's a clear need for all of us to confront caste as it shows up in our communities.
A pandemic was a real disaster for the world. How pandemic reinforced the American caste system? What was seen for you that is seen now?
Yeah, by American caste system, do you mean like American society or specifically Indian Americans, or can you just clarify?
In the both ways.
So I think the pandemic's both across the world, but if you want to just focus on the US and India, they clearly, COVID is a disease that anyone can catch, anyone is susceptible to it, but we saw that it was really the most marginalized communities who are facing the brunt of the pandemic, who are, in terms of being able to take time off of work and stay at home, or to get access to vaccines, or to be able to get, just relief in different ways from government or from other sources, that the pandemic's really reified and strengthened divisions in some ways against different marginalized communities, where in the US, we saw a lot of East Asian people being targeted with violence for this conspiracy idea that they were spreading COVID, and because COVID originated in China. So there was a lot of anti-East Asian violence that happened across the US in recent years. We saw in India, that Muslims were blamed in many ways for spreading COVID. And so there was this conspiracy theory of Corona Jihad and blaming the Tablighi Jamaat's conference early on in the pandemic for spreading it across India. And so we saw in both places that the right-wing conservative people were using the pandemic to target certain communities. And then, of course, there were still disparities in being able to access vaccines, whether it's on the lines of caste and religion in India, or race and class, in the United States. And I think we're still dealing with the after effects of that. And as there's a new pandemic coming up with monkeypox, it's like it may seem to be repeating some of those mistakes again. But I think in both countries, although COVID does not discriminate as a virus, a lot of the government response and broader societal backlash against marginalized groups has increased as a result of the pandemic.
No, that's very true. The caste census is really important, and it holds a crucial importance in drafting policies, especially at national level. In your opinion, to what extent can the caste census help eradicate caste discrimination? And what are the benefits of caste census, and what sort of challenges and obstacles are in the way of holding caste census?
Yeah, I think, I was looking very recently at a survey that was done by the Pew Research Center on religion, diversity, nationalism, in India today. And a lot of the statistics were really quite fascinating, especially when it comes to religion and caste. But I noticed that at the very beginning of that section, they provided some figures for caste breakdown of Indian society. And the figures were dated to 2011, the 2011 sort of like Indian census. And so it's been a very long time, since there was another caste census that was conducted in India. And I think it's really important for that to be done and the results to be publicly available, because at the end of the day, if you're trying to confront caste discrimination, you're trying to confront inequality held by some members of society versus others, it only helps you to know exactly what you're dealing with. And I think the lack of transparency around caste statistics and the caste breakdown of India is driven in large part by a fear from particularly from upper caste or dominant caste leaders that the fact is that the majority of Indians come from caste oppressed communities, SC, ST, OBC backgrounds, and to show that numerically presents a very uncomfortable question for upper caste leaders who dominate Indian government, business, education. Like what there's just such a stark disparity and lack of representation. And so I think that that's definitely one reason why it's taken so long and why it's not been easy, because it would just highlight how stark of a picture we have when we talk about India and the distribution of power and resources, where you have the majority of population coming from more marginalized positions, and then everyone who's in the position of power is, for the most part, coming from very elite, privileged kind of caste backgrounds. And so we definitely, as Hindus for Human Rights, we support the idea of a caste census, and we hope that it'll be undertaken and the results will be publicly available.
What can be some of the steps that society and each of us can take toward melting the caste system? What efforts your organization, Hindus for Human Rights, is paying to eliminate the societal imbalance? What exactly the purpose and goals of Hindus for Human Rights?
For sure. So I think that as Hindus for Human Rights, we really see our goal as educating and activating members of our community, the Hindu community, particularly the diaspora. So Hindus in the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, etc. Our role is really to provide an inclusive, progressive Hindu voice, speaking out on the most important social and political issues of the day. And so for a long time, a lot of the leading kind of Hindu organizations in the diaspora have been more aligned with kind of Hindu nationalist sort of perspective, not open at all to talking about caste or Islamophobia or these sort of issues in a truly genuine and constructive way. And so we are, the first advocacy policy organization to come in and start really build strong relationships with Muslim partners, Dalit partners, Sikh, Christian, etc., and to really provide that progressive Hindu voice when it comes to these sort of issues. And one thing that we do in Coalition, we work with our very close Muslim partner, Indian American Muslim Council, Dalit Solidarity Forum, which is one of the oldest Dalit rights organizations in the United States. And we work with an organization called Tasveer, which is a South Asian American arts organization, to hold an annual civil rights essay and art contest for South Asian American students. The first year asked students to reflect on the Black Lives Matter movement and think about Black Lives Matter and my own South Asian identity. And this past year, we asked students to reflect on the parallels between anti-Black racism in the US and caste discrimination in India, in the diaspora. And so these are like, you can read the winning essays online on a news site called American Kahani. These are middle school students, high school students who grew up here in the US or in India, reflecting on what does it mean to have these identities as Hindus or Indians or Indian Americans, and to really like figure out like, how do I relate to racial justice, or how do I relate to the anti-caste movement? And what we're trying to do is just provide a platform and a community for Hindus in particular to get engaged and speak up, because what has been missing for so long in the last several years in India and the diaspora is a movement of progressive Hindus who are saying, Hindu nationalism does not represent me, caste discrimination does not represent me, and articulating a much more inclusive, progressive vision of that tradition and identity. And more importantly, standing in solidarity with Muslims and Dalits and Christians and other marginalized communities in India and in the diaspora as well. We really need, the need is long past overdue for everyday Hindu Americans, Hindus in the diaspora, Hindus in India, to speak out very forcefully against the current agenda of the government in India, but more broadly against the leaders in our community who are perpetuating caste discrimination or Islamophobia or any of these other harmful attitudes, because it only hurts us, in the end as a community. This narrow-minded focus, this refusal to build bridges or solidarity, it only leads to more and more isolation and closed-minded kind of thinking. And if we're concerned about broadly, like your organization is, minorities across South Asia, we have to be committed to speaking up for the rights of minorities, across the region. And so it's true that in the Indian context, as an organization, we speak up more about violence against Muslims and Christians and Dalits and other communities. But when it comes to Bangladesh or Pakistan or Afghanistan, we raise our voices, against violence against Hindus and Sikhs and Christians and other minorities in those countries, because so often the Hindu right weaponizes the plight of Pakistani Hindus or Afghan Sikhs and Hindus, Bangladeshi Hindus, to say, look how evil Muslims are, look how they're killing Hindus there, and using that to justify their own anti-Muslim violence and policies in India. And so what we're trying to do is really have this morally consistent stand against violence against any minority population, whether the victims are Hindu or the perpetuators are Hindu. We have to speak out against it. And so that's what we're trying to do, is provide that platform for Hindus to really learn and grow and speak out in their own communities.
That's really thoughtful. I really appreciate your vision. So how can your organization and SARIM can collaborate and make a difference in society?
Absolutely. We are truly open to collaboration. We could explore, a wide number of different possibilities, from social media posts together, or more such interviews like this one, doing some media advocacy, bring together joint op-eds, things like that. I think it would be really powerful and useful to be able to collaborate together. We do a lot of congressional advocacy and work just educating the United States government, since that's where we're based, educating them about the situation in India and in South Asia. And we would love to bring you all into that work if that's something that you're interested in working on. And more broadly, I think more and more of our community members need to hear perspectives that are coming from members of your organization, particularly people who are based in countries outside of South Asia, like Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, because for so long, those communities have been largely spoken for by the Hindu right, who have sort of weaponized their situation. And it would be really powerful to be able to hear from Pakistani Hindus who are committed to communal harmony and social justice, and who want to see an end to anti-minority violence in Pakistan and an end to anti-minority violence in India, because that's our shared vision that we're trying to work towards. And so I think our community members and audience would really benefit from hearing from members of your organization and experts that you work with. And we're happy to connect you to anyone else in our network who you might be interested in talking with and interviewing for these sort of collaborations.
Sure, SARIM is open always for such collaboration. So, have you been any South Asian countries, or would you like to come Pakistan for a conference?
Absolutely, yeah. I would love to come to to Pakistan. I've never been. I've been to India only so far in the region. So if there's ever an opportunity or you guys are organizing something, please reach out. It would be an amazing opportunity to be able to visit and meet you all in person.
Sure. As soon as we close the date, I will contact for you there for that.
Okay, great.
So with that note, that's it. Our interview ends here. Thank you very much for taking your time out and doing this talk with me. And I really appreciate that. And all the very best for you for future endurance.
Thank you. Yeah, it was really nice to meet you, face to face, if not in person, Heman. And yeah, I really appreciate you all reaching out to us. And we really do want to collaborate. If there's any ideas that you have, just please, text me or email me, and we can make it happen for sure.
Sure, for sure.
All right.
Okay,
Enjoy the rest of your evening. And
you too.
yeah, we'll stay in touch.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.